I'm sorry, but I didn't enjoy House Moving Castle. Goodreads is a terrible platform. Court of Thorns and Roses is the worst book they've ever read. So many kettles of fish. Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now for today's video, I'm going to be reacting to all of your spicy book opinions, your unpopular bookish opinions. A couple days ago, I put a call out on Instagram stories and on the YouTube community tab to ask you guys for all of your bookish unpopular opinions, and boy, did you send in a few. I have heaps and heaps to react to today, so thank you very much to everyone who popped in a unpopular bookish opinion for this. I got the idea to do this video because I was watching Murphy Napier's video, which was her also reacting to bookish unpopular opinions. I will link Murphy's video in the description down below. Now, before I jump into the video, I just wanted to thank the sponsor of this video, which is Book of the Month. Now, Book of the Month is a monthly subscription service. Their goal is to promote new and emerging authors and to make it easier for people to pick what book to read next. Every month, their team create a curated list of 5 books, and from those 5 books, you can pick the book you want to have sent to you. So the books they have for the month of October are Everything We Didn't Say by Nicole Bart, is about a woman who is solving her family riddle. The Lincoln Highway by Amor Towles, which is set in the 1950s and is about a road trip. The Ex-Hex by Erin Sterling, which is a good witchy romance pick. Harlem Shuffle by Colson Whitehead, which is a historic heist novel. And then finally, The Perishing by Natasha Dion, set in 1930s LA and is about a pioneering journalist. I think for me, I'm going to pick The Ex-Hex to read first, just because I have said that I want to read more outside of my comfort zones in terms of genres, and I don't read very much romance. Also, it's a witchy romance story, so I feel like it fits the October theming very well. So this is the one I'm going to read first. If you're too busy one month to read one of the 5 books, you can just skip that month entirely. Book of the Month does not ship outside the US. However, for those of you who are in the US, you can get your first subscription for $9.99 with the code BOO, which is obviously very Halloween-y themed. Okay, so the very first one is, I love breaking spines. It makes my favorite books look loved on my shelf. Books are meant to be read, broken spines, notes and such. It's okay to dog ear and annotate. We had a few on this. It depends on the book. I'm about to reveal the fact that I'm in my pajama pants. Just ignore that. This is Starting Point by Hayao Miyazaki. It's a compilation of Hayao Miyazaki's like interviews and essays and stuff. I started off not wanting to annotate this and just ended up committing and then drawing all over it in graphite pencil. This is the type of book that I'm fine with annotating in graphite pencil because it's just regular paper. This book was expensive and has glossy paper, and so this is a book that I will not in any way harm. It needs to be kept pristine. This is Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. Look how cracked that spine is. That is a very, very cracked spine. This annoys the crap out of me. I hate that the spine is cracked. Like, it makes me so upset. There's also one here where someone said that they prefer newer books to older books, and I am absolutely in that camp, because for me, I didn't have a lot of books growing up. Like, I went to the library a lot. I didn't actually own really any books other than the Harry Potter books, and so buying a book for me is still a massive luxury. Like, going into the bookstore and buying a brand new book, especially if it's a fancy hardcover. For that reason, I want to keep my books as pristine as possible. However, you do you. I'm not going to judge you. The only thing that really makes my skin crawl is when people use like highlighter or ballpoint pen in books. Covers with people in them are ugly, particularly if they are photos. Some look like magazine perfume ads. Yeah, I think that's fair. Most of the time I don't really like books with people in them, aside from this one, which is The House of Hollow. This is a painting at the very least. Like, it is like a realistic person's face, but it is a little bit painterly, and so I still find it quite interesting. Wuthering Heights is overrated. Jane Austen, the Bronte sisters and the like are boring and overrated. The characters of Wuthering Heights are miserable. I don't like Jane Austen. Okay, so is now a really good time for me to admit that I've never read a Jane Austen book. Mostly when it comes to classics, I enjoy reading Gothic classics. Despite how much I love the Keira Knightley Pride and Prejudice movie, never actually read Pride and Prejudice. I've never read any of the Bronte sisters. Oh wait, hang on. Jane Eyre is written by Charlotte Bronte. That is a Bronte sister. Okay, never mind. I have read Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. That is a Bronte sister. Anyway, I haven't read Jane Austen's work, and so I cannot comment. Honestly, I didn't like the book by Adam Silvera, They Both Die at the End. I think it's overhyped. I loved They Both Die at the End. I cried like a baby. I loved it. I hated The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. I found it predictable and didn't care about the main characters or their romance at all. The highlight of that book for me was Henry. I love V.E. Schwab. I love her so much, but I sort of struggled with the romance aspect of that that book and the relationship of Addie with Luke as well. Norwegian Wood is boring. I can't stand the way Murakami writes women. Gorgeous prose, but his women fall flat for me. That's absolutely fair. The biggest criticism I've always had of Haruki Murakami's work, and I love his work, to be very, very clear, I think that he is an amazing writer. I love his work so much. However, his female characters sometimes leave quite a bit to be desired. In a lot of his works, he will describe all of the women by their breasts and what their breasts look like, and that's like the main metric for describing people, and that like annoys the shit out of me. Like, it's so frustrating. Yeah, it's a fair take. Norwegian Wood is boring. Lots of people fight. That book is really sad. It's really sad. Like, if you're feeling down, don't read that book. The Midnight Library was boring and repetitive. I wanted to love it, but I couldn't. I found that book super cliche, and it took a very, very heavy topic, and I didn't really love how it handled it. I didn't love the ending and the overall meaning, because it explores mental health and a person who tries to commit suicide and then gets another chance, and I sort of found the ending of that book wrapped everything up a bit too neatly to be, yeah, I had some issues with the end of that book specifically. I'm sorry, but I didn't enjoy House Moving Castle. Absolute sacrilege. How dare you? It's fine. Despite the fact that it's probably my favorite book, no book is going to be for everyone. I recently read Six of Crows and did not like it at all. I feel weird knowing everyone else loves it. Six of Crows was a book I DNF'd. I think it's overhyped. I loved Six of Crows. It's by far my favorite YA fantasy I've read in like so many years. I just thought it was really fun and I loved the characters. Also, in terms of like the conversation about books being overhyped, book hype doesn't really affect me. I think if a book is well loved by a lot of people, I don't necessarily assume I'm also going to like it, just because my tastes can be very, very, very picky in certain ways. Please don't kill me, please don't kill me. Sarah J Maas is overhyped. I find her writing poor in vocabulary. The stories are really slow, the characters are shallow as a pond. And then another one that says A Court of Thorns and Roses is the worst book they've ever read. Yeah, okay. The main reason I read A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J Maas is because of Read with Cindy. That's purely the whole reason. I love her so much. She's so funny. Look, I went into that book knowing exactly what type of book it was going to be, and so my expectations were quite low. It depends on what you're reading for, honestly. Like, it depends on what you're reading for. Like, if you just want a fun time, if you're looking for fairy smut and that's what you're after and that's what you consider to be a good time, you're gonna love A Court of Thorns and Roses. It is quite a cliched story. The characters aren't super well fleshed out, but just thought it was a fun time overall, even if I don't personally think it's a good book in terms of the normal things that are good within my like tastes. Also, just like as a rule, I am really, really against book snobbishness. Like, it doesn't matter if something is fairy smut, it doesn't matter if something is like fanfic, or if it's literature, if it's a classic, or if it has awards or whatever. None of it matters. Literally what matters is whether you had a good time while you were reading that book, whether you found that book fun and enjoyable. We can sit around and we can critique all of these books and we can say, you know, I found this good, I found this bad, blah, 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 blah. At the end of the day, it just matters if you like have a good time, because really as human beings, we're all just sacks of flesh, like bumping around into each other and trying to find meaning in life. Let's not have an existential crisis. We are talking about books. I don't know if Sarah J Maas is overhyped. I think people on BookTube have just sort of made a meme out of those books, and I think that it's like the best thing that could have happened to that book series is how talked about it is on BookTube, because I mean, I read the books because of BookTube. Listening to audiobooks and reading physical books aren't the same thing. I'm not saying one is more valid than the other. There are different means of consuming books. Absolutely, I agree with that one. So audiobooks kind of have like an extra layer, I think, because depending on who the audiobook narrator is, it will really, really impact, at least for me, the enjoyability of an audiobook. I really, really hate the take that some people have, which is audiobooks aren't truly reading, because I find that that's a really, really exclusionary way to look at it. Not everyone has the same abilities, and so audiobooks are a really great way to make physical books more accessible to certain groups of people. You do not have to finish a book just because you started it. In fact, I think the reason we don't read as much as we'd like to is because we get stuck pretending to read books we hate because we feel guilty for quitting. Absolutely. I agree with you so strongly. Like, I am a massive advocate for, if you're not enjoying a book, stop reading it. Goodreads is a terrible platform. Storygraph deserves the hype and the user base Goodreads has. Okay, so your dislike for Goodreads, I don't think that's an unpopular opinion anymore. I think it's had the same UI since like when I first started using Goodreads back in 2015. And honestly, I don't use it that much because I don't love it as a platform. In order to track my reading, I generally use a spreadsheet. The House in the Cerulean Sea was definitely for children exclusively, even if it has a good message. And Lucy's dark sense of humor was very cringy. The book was all right at best. Please don't hate me. TJ Klune shouldn't have tried to make the 60s scoop into a cozy novel. The House in the Cerulean Sea is overhyped. Additionally, the fact that it was inspired by the 60s scoop ruins any charm it might have had. So for a start, House in the Cerulean Sea, I think its target audience are children, but I think it knowingly wrote a sort of very depressing 9-to-5 situation, like the situation that Linus was in the beginning of the story, to appeal to adults who like middle grade stories. I think the book was quite clever in doing that. In terms of the criticism for The House in the Cerulean Sea being based on the 60s scoop, this is not a moment in history that I know very much about. I just Googled it. I think that it's a little bit similar to something that happened in Australia, which is what we call the stolen generation. And so in Australia, Indigenous children were taken away from their families and then put with white families or put into with churches, and it was a really, really horrible thing, and it happened all the way up until the 60s, and the trauma of this on Indigenous people is still very much felt today. And so it's a really, really sad and important topic that people need to know about. And so I'm really sorry if I'm getting this wrong, but I think the 60s scoop is similar to that. Here's the thing with The House in the Cerulean Sea. I think it's a really, really good book. I think that book has some of the most positive representations of fatherly love, especially of a gay father figure, of found families, of adoptive families, of accepting people for being different. You know, the book to me looks at these children being taken from their homes as a very, very bad thing. I think that's quite clear in the story. And so that was my perspective coming out of that book, that it had a lot of really positive things out of it. You know, you could have an argument that TJ Klune shouldn't have used that as an inspiration piece because he's a Caucasian author, but then you sort of also have this like other argument of, you know, children's media has such an impactful socializing element to it. Children's stories teach values through allegory. And, you know, so a child who's not necessarily going to learn about the 60s scoop or the stolen generation might pick up The House in the Cerulean Sea. And so they learn about this concept through allegory, through a fantastical story. And so do you say, no, we should take away this allegory from kids to learn from? They should only learn about the specific historical incident? I don't honestly have an answer for this one. I don't know enough about this topic and, you know, the impact of this book, whether the positives of the book weigh out the negatives of the book. And on the one hand, authors have been using allegory since the beginning of bloody time to write their stories. But on the other hand, you know, TJ Klune as a Caucasian author drawing from the trauma of a marginalized group of Indigenous people to write a story. I think it's a much, much bigger discussion of, you know, the appropriateness of whether authors can draw from certain topics. But thank you to the people who did comment that, because I think it is an important point when looking at The House in the Cerulean Sea and looking at, you know, the appropriateness of what we're talking about, how we talk about things, how authors use, you know, history and the trauma of people to make their stories. Okay, moving along from that very, very heavy topic. And on to a lighter one. Society has outgrown its need for Harry Potter, as formative and beautiful as it was for all of us. This whole thing has caused me so much pain. The whole situation with J.K. Rowling was horrible because I love Harry Potter to pieces. It's really, really important to me. I have a quote from the book tattooed on my skin. And when J.K. Rowling came out with those tweets, I felt so betrayed and heartbroken because Harry Potter, for me, has always been a very, very safe space where, you know, people get to be included and treated equally. And then she came out with all of these opinions that were very, very exclusionary and damaging to people from the trans community, which was horrible. I obviously no longer follow J.K. Rowling on Twitter, and I am pretending that the books were written by someone who doesn't have that opinion. But has society outgrown its need for Harry Potter? Potentially. I personally still love the book series because of how fundamental they were for me as a child growing up. And mentioned already in this video, didn't have a lot of books growing up, so I reread the Harry Potter books to death because it was the only book series I owned. And it sort of got me through all of this stuff, and so it's really, really important for me. In terms of everyone else though, I suppose we'll see over the next 10, 20, 50 years the impact impact of Harry Potter. Harry Potter book 6 was the best one of the series. I'm not sure if that's an unpopular opinion because I think a lot of people like that one. Okay, the Harry Potter books in order from most favorite to least favorite. The first one, the 7th one, the 3rd one, the 4th one, the 6th one, the 2nd one, the 5th one. The 5th one is the worst one for me. It was way too long. James Potter and Sirius Black don't deserve that much love. They were bullies. They were absolutely bullies. Snape is also super abusive. People should focus less on whether they find a fictional character likable or not because it really has nothing to do with the quality of the story, whether the reader can appreciate, feel empathy for, or root for the character. Agreed. Hard agree with you there. I really don't give a shit if the character is likable. I care if the character is believable and if they feel like a real person. Like, it literally is not a metric that I care about at all. In order for a character to feel real, they need to have both positives and negatives, and that goes for antagonists as well as protagonists. Book plots whereby nothing happens aren't necessarily bad or boring when there's good writing. Agree. I really loved the book by Ocean Vuong has autumn leaves on the cover. What's it called? On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous. I loved that book, and though it doesn't have a lot of like linear plot progression, I thought it was a really beautiful story. There's a lot of books I really love which don't have super strong plot. People should be able to read what they want from whatever author they want, and others should leave them alone about it. It's also ridiculous to judge older books by modern standards or books from other non-Western cultures by Western standards. Yes, I agree with you. Absolutely. People should be allowed to, as I said earlier, book snobbishness I think is really silly. In terms of judging older books by modern standards, I think it's a silly idea to throw a book in the bin and be like, that's problematic, we're not reading that. That was me imagining myself throwing a book in the bin because it's an older book. Editing Christy here. I just realized that I missed a really important unpopular opinion that someone put in the community tab. I don't know how I missed it, but I was just scrolling back through them and I saw it, and I realized that this person did a much better job and a more eloquent job of explaining the point that I was trying to make here. So I'm just going to go ahead and read out their bookish unpopular opinion. When people read older books and everything is problematic, so they say the books are bad. Yes, it is problematic by today's standards, but it wasn't at the time it was written. Same goes for TV. Books should be read with the time and context in mind, acknowledging the problem, but also realistic that in the past things were different. Such books are not bad and awful. We can learn a lot from them about how people used to live and think. Yes, I definitely agree with that. And this was the point I was trying to make with this whole section, and then just did a very bad job at it. So thank you to this person for commenting this. It's important though to look critically at the things that we read and the things that we consume. As I mentioned earlier when we were talking about TJ Klune, all of the media that we consume has a socializing element to it. As human beings, we learn our values like consciously and subconsciously from the art that we consume, from the people around us, and then we go on to make more art, and then that has a sort of knock-on effect, and this is how culture sort of like keeps churning. We all have certain biases, and so I think it's really important to keep an eye open. For me also as a content creator and as a writer, I think it's really important for me to look critically at the stuff that I'm reading, at the movies I watch, because when I go to make stuff, I want to make sure that I'm making things in the most inclusive way I possibly can, and you know, in a way that doesn't harm people and doesn't contribute to people's marginalizations or to stereotypes. In terms of a Western reader judging a non-Western book with Western standards, that's a whole kettle of fish around ethnocentrism. So that's another really big discussion, because if you're a person who's grown up in a Western country, say America or Australia or the UK, and you've grown up your whole life there, and then you're looking at a different culture, it's physically impossible for you to drop that like inherent cultural bias, because that's the culture you've grown up in, right? So if you're reading a book by an author from a different culture to you, set in a different culture, I think ethnocentrism is something we really need to pay attention to. Yeah, it's really hard for a Westerner to not judge a book by Western standards just by virtue of the fact of how ethnocentrism works, and the fact that like if you grew up in a Western culture, you're always going to have that, you know, lens through which to see the world. I think, however, A, it's really important to read books from cultures that are different to your own, and B, it's really important to go in with an open mind and not tear a book apart because it has stuff in it that you don't necessarily agree with, because that stuff that you don't necessarily agree with could be down to ethnocentrism or cultural difference. That was a really long-winded answer. This are just so many kettles of fish. There's a lot of really heavy topics here. Close friendship endgame is pretty much always better than a romantic one. I think there needs to be more more stories that focus on friendship, especially in fantasy, especially in YA fantasy actually. I hate it when stories just seem to feel the need to force characters into relationships. I don't know if it's definitively always better, but I wish there were more friendships. Self-inserts aren't always a bad thing, especially if an author is writing about a similar experience. The only true self-insert novel I think I've read is probably The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath. I don't know that it's necessarily a bad thing. I only really think it's bad if you're reading a book and something makes the book stop being believable. So if you're reading a book and the author has clearly placed themselves in the story as a character and that rips you out of the story, I think that would be a bad thing. Hard world building is overrated, soft world building is underrated. I just want good characters in the story. The story really just needs to be what the story needs to be to service the actual overall narrative. I don't really mind if there's hard world building or soft world building. A lot of YA fantasy are really repetitive now and tend to be overhyped. Without a doubt, YA fantasy is definitely the genre that I end up DNFing the most because I find cliches really, really annoying. If I have to read about one more battle royale, I swear to God, like, speaking of which, we are like 6 episodes into Squid Game and it's very, very good. That's not a YA, but it is a battle royale. Anyway, to a certain degree, I agree with you, but also when we look at YA as a category for young adults, for teenagers who are constantly growing up and cycling out of this age group, I sort of understand the cliches a little bit more because like your target demographic is only in this demographic for a short period of time and then they're adults. Although there obviously is a very large portion of adults who also read YA, but your primary demographic is supposed to be teenagers because it's a young adult book, right? I mean, that's not really an excuse for making things repetitive, but yeah, often I'll pick up a YA fantasy and find it a bit repetitive and cliche, and then I'll put it straight back down. Okay, and that I think should be the very last one because I've been filming for a very long time and now I have a lot of editing to do. Thank you to everyone who put in bookish, unpopular opinions, and you know, it can be quite a daunting thing to just stand up and say like, I don't quite agree with this stuff. So I do really appreciate people like popping their opinions in the community tab and over on Instagram. Thank you guys so very much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and an enormous thank you to everyone over on Patreon for supporting this channel. Please feel free to check out Patreon. There is a link in the description down below. Take care everyone, and I will see you soon. Bye bye.